All right, thank you for watching Striving for Perfection, the YouTube channel that is dedicated to covering topics that you give me from a biblical, theological, or even a philosophical perspective. I must give you a warning about this particular video before we get into it. This video may upset you. It may make you angry either with me or it may make you mad with the church that you are attending. That is not my intentions. I don't want it to be that way. I wanted to spark thought and help you to just start looking at things from a perspective that says it's all right to actually question what I'm being taught to make sure that it is correct. So we're going to be talking about the giving today. But before we do that, click that icon right there and check out my man. That is Terrence Robinson, T.L. Robinson. He is the one that's providing the music, and we do appreciate that. So again, that is T.L. Robinson, and I think the icon is about right here now. If you put your pointer up there, go click on it and check him out. 4 things that I ask from you every time. Please subscribe, please comment, please tell others about the channel, and tell me what you'd like, what else you'd like me to cover. All right, so today we're going to be talking about giving. And as we jump into this, let's again remember that this is not designed to make you upset, but if you are of the faint of heart, you might want to click off and not watch this. All right, so we're going to be talking about tithing today. We've already looked at before, during, and now we're going to be looking at after the law. Next time we're going to look at seed sowing and the prosperity gospel, and then we're going to look at free grace giving. So again, today, tithing after the law. In other words, tithing today. Should the church be tithing? All right, so we are going to look at this like we always do from the perspective of tradition versus Bible, because there is a traditional teaching in the church as it pertains to giving, and there is what the Bible says about giving. And the tradition, of course, is to tithe. But here's the first problem, and we're going to see that today. After the law, there is no verse, not one verse, nothing on tithing, not one that indicates that we're supposed to be tithing today. Now, there are some verses that use the word tithing in them. When you get to the book of Hebrews, he talks about tithing, but it is from the perspective of what was under the old covenant is not better than what you have under the new covenant, and he's proving that by using tithing as an analogy. You have to go and read it. In the Gospels, Jesus talks about tithing, but he's talking to the Israelites at the time. At that particular time, they are still under the old covenant, and he's explaining to them that their hearts are not right in what they are doing. What does history tell us? This is where you're probably going to really, really, really get a little bit upset when you find out what was actually going on over the past 2,000 years with the church as it pertains to tithing. And then we're going to look at what tradition tells us about, Malachi 3, 8 through 10, and how it's under, Malachi 8 through 10 is actually written under the law, but how they flip it around to try to make it for the church. So of course, what we're going to do is we're going to break down that particular passage of scripture and find out what Malachi was really saying. So the tithe in the New Testament, I could leave this blank. I could stop right there and I could say, it ain't there, because it ain't. But what I'm going to give you are some quotes so that you understand that I'm not making this stuff up. This is from Baker's Dictionary, 1960, and repeated by Hendrickson, who is a Bible scholar, theologian, hermeneutical teacher, well known. The silence of the New Testament writers, particularly Paul, regarding the present validity of the tithe can be explained only on the ground that the dispensation of grace has no more place for a law of tithing than it has for a law on circumcision. So in other words, if you're going to tithe, you're just as well to include circumcision along with that. Here is one, Frank Viola, talking straight talk to the elders of the church. Brothers, it wasn't until the 4th century under Constantine, the Roman emperor who converted to Christianity and made a Christian state out of the empire. It wasn't until Constantine that the church had a paid clergy. Church leaders did not receive salary from God's people until the days of Constantine. Do you understand? Tithes were not practiced among Christians until 800 years past. It was not part of the 1st century church's practice. That is what we're really going to be concentrating on, and that is the apostles in the early church and tithing from a church history perspective. And then we're going to walk through history, and you're going to really see some things. So First of all, this is out of Hastings Dictionary of the Apostolic Church. So look at this. It is admitted universally that the payment of tithes or the tenth of possessions for sacred purposes did not find a place within the Christian church during the age covered by the apostles and their immediate successors. So, according to church history, during the time of the apostles, and remember, all of the apostles were Jewish and came out of the old covenant, so they came out of a system of tithes. They never imposed that on the church. They understood it as part of the old covenant, as part of the Jewish uh, Judaism. That's what it was a part of. Now, this is the one that really kills me because here is a non-Christian reference from the Encyclopedia of Britannica. The Christian church depended at first on voluntary gifts from its members. Voluntary gifts from its members. That is absolutely true, backed up in the Bible. You see it in the book of Acts. That is how the church financed itself. Voluntary gifts. That's what we call free will giving. Here, H.W. Clark, A History of Tithes. This comes from his book. The liberality of the Christians then far exceeded anything that could have been collected by tithes. They were actually giving more than a tenth, and no tithe was imposed upon them, and they freely did it. So let's talk about this throughout history. Who in the world came up with the idea that the church was supposed to be tithing? Well, this is the actual statute of Constantine, and he was a Roman emperor called Constantine the Great. And if you've ever studied church history, you know about him, you've heard his name. But in the 4th century, he used tithes in order to finance the church. And what you got to understand with Constantine is he was a pagan who believed in a whole lot of, the paganistic stuff that were going around in the 3rd and the 4th century in the Greco-Roman world of the day. And when he converted over to Christianity, he decided to marry the church to the state. So he tried to make an empire Christian, force everyone to put Christianity as the #1 religion, and thus making it a part of the government. Now, in doing so, he used his vast resources as emperor to build temples. Have you ever wondered why, when you look at Catholic churches, they have such beautiful, cathedrals? Well, it started with Constantine. And as a matter of fact, I will blame him for the fact that even Protestants today, for whatever reason, we are, and I'm going to put it to you this way, we're just about hell bent on building buildings. I mean, and the better we can build, the bigger we can build, the more we think we've accomplished something. That comes from him, because in the paganistic ways that he came from, building temples was the way that you honored a god. So he financed it at first, but then he flipped the script, because after financing the building of temples and everything himself, he looked at it, he said, no, I'm going to stop doing that. I'm going to let you as members of the church finance it. And so he came up with the tithe. And he wanted to do this with his universal church, that is the Catholic Church, or what we know as the Catholic Church, the universal church. And in order to motivate Christians to do that, once he had them in the temples and once he had built all this beautiful stuff for them, and them coming out of a paganistic way, of their paganistic ways, understanding that these temples were bigger and more elaborate than the ones that they had come from, he basically convinced them that if they did not tithe, that they would go to hell. Plain and simple, he tied it to salvation. And again, if you think, well, no one would do something like that today, well, ask a Seventh-day Adventist what happens if they don't tithe. It's in their writings. You go to hell. All right. So, 6th century, the Council of Tours. These are Catholic bishops, Roman Catholic Church. Tithing had kind of faded out. And these guys got together and decided that they would use Acts chapter 15 and the Jerusalem Council as a blueprint for allowing them to come together and function in councils. So what they basically did was they as church leaders got together and decided what the church overall was going to do. Now, if you go to Acts chapter 15, and if you read what was taking place at the Jerusalem Council, all this is that Peter had showed up and had started talking about the fact that the Gentiles were a part of the church. And so all of the church leaders were Jewish. And some of them thought, well, okay, these Gentiles need to go get circumcised. They need to go do these things that would have been under the law. And then James, the leader of the council, talked with everyone and then came back with an opinion that basically said, we're not going to put the yoke of the law on them. That's not what this is about. We're going to give them a couple of things to do that have nothing to do with the law, but would help them to become better Christians. In other words, you can't take stuff in the law and then put it on the Christians of today is basically what happened. But they, ironically, took something from the law and they added tithes. And if you did not pay your tithes, because this is how they were going to finance their lifestyles, you were excommunicated from the church. Now, according to Catholic doctrine, that meant that you lost your salvation. I mean, if you're not part of the church, you're not saved. So basically, they did what Constantine did. They just came and told you that if you didn't tithe, that was it. Now, interestingly enough, this is the same group of people that decided they were going to chain up Bibles to pulpits. They were the same group of people that decided the Bible needed to be read in one language that most people couldn't read, and that all of their priests needed to preach in a rustic German language that most people couldn't understand, the common person couldn't understand. So what you had then is the common church goer of the day, the common member of the church, couldn't read the Bible, wasn't allowed to, and then couldn't understand what was being preached. So they don't know what was being said. So all they had is whatever they instructed them to do, which was tithe or go to hell. Then in the 10th century, the Church of England. Well, the Church of England pulled a Constantine, if you ask me, because they took their civil law, they actually took the church, married the church to the state, to the government, and then in the civil law, they made everybody tithe to the church. It was mandatory, it was a tax. And since at this particular time, they were on hard times. This created a lot of anger and hatred for the bishops who were in charge of the church, because really they were politicians. And so they had gotten the government to basically impose a tithe. They got the king to impose a tithe. And while their members were poor, could barely eat, these guys were running around, in their big robes, beautiful robes, and had people kissing them on the fingers and all of those types of things. And they were getting all of the stuff that they wanted and just lived a great lifestyle. So let's get to where you really want to get to. And this is where you're really going to get mad. Okay. The Protestant Church of America. So if you don't know why we're called Protestants, real quickly, Martin Luther protested against the Catholic Church, and that is where we get the name Protestant from, all right, in his protesting of the Catholic Church. So we're all protesting if we're Protestants. All right, all over the world, since Martin Luther, up until the 1800s, they taught free will giving. It was free. You did what you wanted to do when it came to giving to the church. And when I get to free will giving in a few videos later, you'll understand why that works. All right. In America, the church was supported by the government. See, a lot of people don't understand this. You know where public schools came from? They came from the church. It was the government, which was basically Christian Judeo. And the government basically said that people needed to be able to read the Bible so they would understand how to vote. That's what the government said back then. And so what they did is they said, what's the best place for this to happen, as far as everyone needed to learn how to read, is at the church. So the government supported churches with finances so that they could teach people how to read. But in the 1800s, they basically said that the church and state had to be separate. They didn't need to be together like that. And so the government support stopped in the 1800s. And when it did, guess what they came up with? Fundraising and tithing. And again, when we get to free will giving, I'm going to show you that churches are not supposed to be doing fundraising. I'm sorry. Get mad at me if you want to, but they're really not. God never said finance the church through fundraising. That's not what he says. And then the whole tithing thing pops back up. So I want you to consider this, that for all of those years, except for those 3 times that I showed you, in the 4th century, 6th century, and the 10th century, the church did not tithe. It was not universal like it is today. It wasn't that everybody followed it. So you got to ask this simple question: how in the world, if it just hadn't been done before, how did they convince the Protestant churches of America that people were supposed to tithe, that it was their duty, their obligation, their necessity, their need, all of those things that we're told today? How in the world could they come up with a way to make us tithe? There it is. Malachi. Will a man rob God? And hey, I was right there. I went along with it. I was one of the biggest tithers. I even let a light bill go bad and my lights get cut out in my apartment because I was going to tithe no matter what. And so, I come from that background, that tradition of hearing it every Sunday. Will a man rob God? It's now the tithing period. Will all the tithers stand? Will a man rob God? Don't you want the windows of heaven to open up? There it is. And it's one of the biggest, and I'm going to say it, schemes I've ever seen. Will a man rob God? Have you ever had a preacher just start yelling that at you? Will a man, don't that make you feel bad? Will a man rob God? I mean, they will put everything into it. Yet you have robbed me. They will hold the Bible up. They will scream, don't you see what it says? You've robbed me in tithes and in offering. They get deep with it. And then, oh, I love this. You are cursed with a curse. They get deep growling with it. Yeah, this guy's one of the biggest ones. I mean, he pushed it hard. Prove me now and see. Won't, yeah, here's another one. Won't I open up the windows of heaven for you? And I love him because he's funny. He's joke a minute, but you know what? You better tithe because you're gonna get your blessings poured out. If you don't tithe, your blessings ain't gonna be poured out. He says in that nice country voice. All right. So what's the big deal? Malachi 3, 8, and 10. Let's put this in black and white. Not gonna use a lot of graphics on this. Let's just plain do this. Let's find out what's going on. All right. First of all, let's do an observation. Good Bible study. We're going to do observation, interpretation, application. We're going to do it right. Do you see you all over this? Right? Yet you, but you are cursed, verse 9, for you. I mean, the whole nation of you. Right down here in verse 10, you. I mean, 7 times we have the word you. So do you think he has someone specific in mind? Is he talking to someone directly? Is someone here? Well, that one time he identified you as the whole nation. So is he talking to a nation or is he talking to the church? Because here's the problem. If he's talking to a nation, and if the you is the reference in the nation, how did you come up with that was directed to the church or to me as an individual? Where did you come up with that? And then we have we in the question back. How have we? So we, it's plural. So you is plural. So we're talking about a group. We're talking about a nation. So really, we need to understand, what's going on with Malachi. Who is he? Who is he writing to? What is this all about? So here's this guy Malachi, and we don't really know a lot about Malachi. However, there are some things we do know. And we know Jesus quoted him. Jesus quoted him when he was talking about John. When John, he's the one that said there would be one crying in the wilderness. Malachi had to prophesy that. But most of what he wrote about was what was going on at the time that he was living. So his name means my messenger. So that's probably not his name. There's some theological thought, and it holds some water, that he was probably a priest in the priesthood, a Levite. Now he's anonymous. We don't think we know his actual name, but his ministry, now this is key, occurred during the era of Nehemiah and Ezra. And this is going to help you to understand what was going on. All right. So obviously the you is referring to the Jewish nation. You should have picked that up right off the bat. I mean, we're over in the Old Testament. Who is this directly written to? This is written to the Jewish nation, the Israelites. If it's at the time of Nehemiah and Ezra, this is when they've come out of captivity. And when they came out of captivity, some strange things were going on. So we've got some interesting clues within Malachi that helps us to understand what was actually going on when he wrote this. First of all, they were having some issues with their sacrificing in the temple. It had been reinstated, so we know that they'd come out of their captivity, and now they had rebuilt the temple. They were rebuilding Jerusalem, and they were doing all of those things. So we know that they were living under a Persian governor. Malachi 1 and 8 calls it the Persian governor, which means it's during Ezra and Nehemiah's time when they came out. So it's either probably Artaxerxes or it is Cyrus, but probably Artaxerxes at the particular time. They were intermarrying with non-Jews, and that was just a common thing to do. They just come out of captivity. They started marrying everybody around them. And the Mosaic law explicitly forbid that. The religious observance in the temple priest, it was lax at best, which meant that they weren't doing what they were supposed to be doing. So the standards were very low. And so then there was, of course, the practice of tithing in the temple treasury was routinely neglected. And that's the part that we're going to concentrate on. So we understand the time period. We understand what their issues were. But what we really need to do is understand what was going on with the tithing specifically, because that is what we are concentrating on. But now that we know the time, and we know that this was the time of Nehemiah's time, we can go to Nehemiah 13 and 10, and Nehemiah is making some reforms because he's found some problems. So here's a list in chapter 13. You'll see a list of things that he found out about. So here in verse 10, he says, I also found out that the portions of the Levites had not been given to them. Now, portions of the Levites, this is a reference to the tithes and the offerings and those things that were going into the storehouse that the Levites would eat from. This is how they had to eat. But so that the Levites and the singers, understand the Levites did everything. They were the choir. If you want to say it, they were the ushers. They were the nurses guild, whatever you want to call it. They were everybody that did everything there in the temple. They did the sacrificing, they did prayers, they did all of that stuff, and they led all of that. And it says that who did the work, that is the work that would have been part of the temple ministry, and had fled each to his field, which meant that they had gone out and bought fields in order to plant, because the people were not bringing their portions, their tithes to them. They couldn't eat. So what do? Start? No, you go, you buy a field and you start planting. Remember, the Levites were the ones that did not receive an inheritance of land. God said their inheritance would be the tithes that the Israelites had to pay in order for them to live. So he says, so I confronted the officials and said, why is the house of God forsaken? Now, the house of God would have been the temple. And if the temple is forsaken, that means there's no worshiping going on. And so what you have here then is this phenomenon. If the Levites are not doing their temple duties, then God is not receiving worship. Do you see a problem? They're not doing their temple duties because the people were not paying their tithes. And because they weren't paying their tithes, his worship wasn't being done. All right. But what would happen if the Jews disobeyed the Mosaic law? What would happen? Well, most people go, yeah, God would take them and take them into captivity. He'd wipe them out. He'd do all of these things. We know all of that. But look at Deuteronomy 11 and 16. Now, you've really got to go back, if this is your first time watching one of these videos, and see the video of tithing under the law. Because just prior to these verses, you have the verses where Moses tells them that God is going to bless them. He's going to bring the rain, the early rain and the late rain, and that is going to cause the land to produce the grain that they will eat from and that the animals will eat from. So here's the deal. If they're eating and they have animals to eat, then they're going to be healthy and they're going to reproduce, have more kids. The animals are going to be healthy. They're going to reproduce, have more cattle for them, and then they're going to have more of what they need. And then the land is going to produce, and they're going to have more olive trees for oil. They're going to have more grapes for wine. They're going to have everything they need. But in verse 16, he says, beware that your hearts are not deceived, and that you do not turn away and serve other gods and worship them, or the anger of the Lord will be kindled against you, and he will shut up the heavens so that there will be no rain, and the ground will not yield its fruit, and you will perish quickly from the good land which the Lord is giving you. All right. So you understand, he's basically telling them, if you don't obey, if you mess up and start going to others and serving other gods and worshiping them, then God is going to shut up the heavens. 2 Chronicles 7 and 13. The funny thing with 2 Chronicles is everybody knows verse 14, but nobody talks about verse 13, because if you put verse 13 in front of verse 14, what you'll stop doing is using 2 Chronicles 7 and 14 to explain every time I'm doing this in the middle of a pandemic. And the first thing that comes up, because there's a pandemic and we're under some stress, is somebody wants to run and say, and if my people who are called by name humble themselves and pray, this is God's judgment. Look at 2 Chronicles 7 and 13. If I shut up the heavens so that there is no rain, why would God do that? He would do that to the Israelites. Why? Because their blessings were tied to the land. Or if I command the locusts to devour the land, or if I sent pestilence among my people. And then he goes into the whole turn from your wicked ways. But what I want you to notice in Deuteronomy and in 2 Chronicles, and you can find this in other places, he will shut up the heavens so that there will be no rain. In 2 Chronicles, shut up the heavens so there is no rain. If you don't miss that, you'll miss what's going on in Malachi. And then he says, I command the locusts to devour the ground. So if you don't act right, I'll shut up the heavens so that there will be no rain. And before you can go to eating what's already been produced, I will send the locusts to devour what is there. And then he says, the only way to get away from this is to seek my face and turn from the wicked ways. And what do you think Malachi is writing what he's writing? He's writing to tell the people to turn from their wicked ways, to get back to God, because they were despondent at this particular time. They were lax in what they were doing. A lot of it had to do with the fact that they come out of captivity and they were actually looking for the Messiah. That's why he had to prophesy about the Messiah as well. All right, so let's break down Malachi 3:8-10. Now that we have the observational background, we can begin to do the interpretive work of understanding what Malachi is saying to them. So we have this question: will a man rob God? That is a head scratcher at first, because if the earth is the Lord's and all that is in it, then how in the world can you take what's already God? How can I take anything from God? Some people say it's just a rhetorical question. The answer is yes. Well, yes, how? And then he says, yet you are robbing me. Why does he say, yet you are robbing me? Will a man rob God? Well, how do you rob God? He says, but you're robbing me. But you say, but remember, you is the Israelites here. All right, it's not Kevin. It's not you. You can't put your name in here. But you, Israelites, say, how have we robbed you? He says, in tithes and offering. So hold on. If I go back to the law, and if I read the law is clear. The tithes is the Lord's. Jacob vowed the tithe of the land to God. And if you don't know what I'm talking about when I just said that, go back and watch the other two videos, and you'll see that I'm not just making this up out of thin air. This is why they had to tithe, was because of Jacob's vow. So he says it's in tithes and in offering. All right, let's really concentrate on this whole concept right here. In tithes and offering. Under the law, tithes and offerings were the portions spoken of in Nehemiah 13 that were used to support the Levites. We just read that, right? Okay, if this was neglected, then the singing and the temple ministry would cease. No more singing, no more praise, no more prayers. The sacrifices have gone crazy. All of that stuff is now off. So if we just look at verse 8 for just a second, and let's understand what's actually going on here. Tithes and offerings were from the land, and it wasn't money. Now, you please understand this. That's the other thing. God never took money. In fact, go back and watch that second video on tithing under the law, and you will see that even when they had money, what he told them to do with it, it was to buy what? Produce, because produce is what he wanted. All right. They belonged to God because Jacob had vowed a tenth of the land. That's what I said before. So it was stuff from the land. God wanted the stuff from the land for them to give that. It wasn't money. Okay. So there's 3 tithes under the law. And then one of them, all of that went to the Levites. And remember, it's produce. So what are they going to do with produce? They're going to eat it. All right. The other 2, one was for celebration. They all got to celebrate together. And then one was for widows, orphans, and strangers, those who could not have any income. It was welfare to take care of them. And the Levites were included in both of those as well. All right. So it's worship. All right. What's being robbed? What he says here, if you read this very carefully, and if you read it in Hebrew, you'll understand he's not saying that you robbed me by tithes and offering. He says in tithes and offering. What's in the tithes and offering? In the tithes and offerings comes out of that is his worship. Now, worship would be interrupted and God will be robbed of worship. And this makes perfect sense, because if the earth is the Lord and the fullness thereof and they that dwell therein and all of that stuff, how could you give God something material or physical? How is it that he wants something material or physical? He doesn't want anything material or physical. He didn't create us for us to give him anything material or physical. He created us to give him the one thing he couldn't give himself. The one thing that he can't give himself, love. Now, most people will stop and say, well, what do you mean he could give himself love? No, self-love is self-love. But it's better to be loved by someone outside of you. And you need to give them a free will because you want them to choose to love you. That's what real love is about. If you want me to explain that deeper, let me know and I will do a video on that. All right. It's the only thing man can give God, love. And it's manifested in worship. Worship means worthship. What is he worth? Your obedience to him is an act of love. Your praise is an act of love. Everything you do is an act of love. It is worship. So if they stopped giving the tithes and offering, then God, who had set this thing up so that under the old covenant, the worship of him would always continue. All of that's been taken away. All right, so let's look at verse 9, because I think we got verse 8. Verse 9 says, you are cursed with a curse. I love it when preachers talk about this one, because they're going to scream it from the mountaintops. They're going to come down. They're going to point at you. They're going to tell you, man, you are cursed with a curse. You don't want to be cursed with a curse, do you? I know I don't want to be cursed with a curse. Cursed with a curse sounds really, really bad. I wonder what it means. So let's look at verse 9. He says, curse with a curse, for you are robbing me. He says the whole nation. So the curse involves the nation. Now, in the previous verse, it was all about the tithes and the offering, right? Now, in Malachi chapter 2, in verse 1, he says this, and now this commandment is for you, O priests. If you do not listen, and if you do not take it to heart to give honor to my name, says the Lord of hosts, then I will send the curse upon you. Ooh, and I will curse your blessings. Okay, so let's back up a second. Because what he's saying here, he's saying to the priest, he says he's going to send a curse upon you, and he says, I will curse your blessings. The word blessings, whenever you go to the Old Covenant and you look at the Old Covenant and you want to know what blessings refers to, it always refers to the land and what the land is producing. So what he's saying here, cursing your blessings, means the land itself would not produce. And so then he says, and indeed, I have cursed them already. Notice he says already, because you're not taking it to heart. You're not listening to me. Since you don't want to listen to me, since you don't want to follow the covenant, he says, I'm going to send a curse upon you. I'm going to curse your blessings. And I've cursed them already. So we understood that that was the rain. So what he's basically saying here is, I've already stopped the rain. All right. I'm going to send you the curse of a curse. I've already cursed you already, which means that what you're living on right now is basically what you had from the rain that you got previously. But see, the curse upon a curse here is really the devourer. Now he can send in the locusts, eat up what you got, and you're going to be starving. This is what he's referring to. So to be cursed with a curse, the rain would stop, the land's production that would be their blessings. And don't forget the devouring locusts and pestilence and all that other stuff that he can send. So this is really, really deep. So we understand that, what we now have is we understand this curse is mainly the rain, and then what could come of that. So let's get to verse 10. All right, verse 10, bring the whole tithe into the storehouse so that there may be food in my house. Okay, hold on. First he said, bring the whole tithe, which means some people were either bringing their tithes and other people weren't, or they were just bringing partial. They weren't bringing all of it. I mean, remember I told you that this was Jacob's vow. Jacob vowed a tenth of what God gave him back to God. Jacob never possessed the land. God gave him the land. We found that out in Genesis. God gave him the land. Jacob never possessed the land, but God said, I give it to you and your descendants. Your descendants possessed the land. Going into the land, Moses told them, here are your tithes. This was in response to Jacob's vow. So the whole tithe, he says, you got to bring it all. Now, this gets me. How many of y'all have heard the preacher stand up and say, you got to bring your tithes into the storehouse. You got to come to the church with it. You got to bring it to the church, because the church is the storehouse. I didn't know that. When did the church become the storehouse? And then they say, so that there might be meat in my house, but they never want to try to tell you what meat in my house means. And so I look at this and I get bothered, because the whole nation now is suffering, because God says here that they have to put food in my house. So question, is he hungry? Is God hungry? Does God need to eat? Does God need them to bring him food to eat? I mean, is that what's going on here? Because that's what it says. It says here, whole tithe into the storehouse. So there's a storehouse where, so that he have food in his house. Why does he need food in his house? It's for the Levites. All right, I know I'm going and being all dramatic, but it's for the Levites. Did you ever stop and think about it? It was for the Levites? By the way, your preacher is not a Levite. The Levites were the priesthood, and you and I, we are the royal priesthood. Just because you're a preacher, you don't put yourself in the term of, you're not a priest. All right. So the ministers or reverends or bishops or whatever they call themselves, they're not Levites. All right. And so he says, I need the food. Why? I got to feed the Levites. Otherwise, the worship stops. And test me now in this, says the Lord of hosts. So when he says test me now, he's basically saying, trust me. See if I'm telling you the truth. If I will not open for you the windows of heaven. Now, I have heard some of the craziest things in the world. I've heard people talk about, the Windows icon. Remember that old Windows icon? Those of you that are old enough to remember that when Windows first came out back in the 90s, that Windows icon would be floating across the screen. And we'd look at that. And then I heard somebody say, if you click on that, what would happen is it would open up something. The Windows are like that Windows icon. They open up. And then they, in the words of Brother Duplantis, the stuff will be poured out on your houses, cars, boats. And come on, open up for you the windows of heaven. We just saw that if they were disobedient, God was going to shut up the heavens. This is about rain. That's all this is about. If it doesn't rain, the ground doesn't produce. If it doesn't produce, they don't have the grain. Their animals don't have anything to eat. So when the animals don't have anything to eat and they start to starve, they stop reproducing. So they start to lose animals. They got to eat whatever's there. They end up dying. The animals do, because they can't eat. So the people have to eat whatever's left. And then if he descends and devours, they come and eat up the vegetation that they have. Well, you're in pretty poor shape. By the way, the Israelites, if they couldn't eat, they become malnutritious. Guess what happens? Pestilence comes. And if pestilence comes, reproduction stops. And if reproduction stops and people are dying, then you will lose a lot of people in the nation. He says, but if you will just do what is right, trust me. Then he says he will pour out for you a blessing. Remember, blessing is always tied to the land. So it will produce until it overflows. If you watch my last video, you understand he gave them everything they needed. He told them that they would have enough to eat and be satisfied. And then they would still do their tithing and everything else. He never asked them to sacrifice. You ever had somebody tell you that you need to sacrifice in your giving? That's a lie. All right. When the early and later rains come, the land produces, and that is their blessing. Okay, so let's see if we understand Malachi 3:8-10. First of all, verse 9, God is being robbed of his worship. All right. Verse 10, the Jewish nation is already cursed with a lack of rain. And in verse 11, see if you keep reading, because it's always good to keep reading. We get this in verse 11, because there's locusts. Then I will rebuke the devourer for you, so that it will not destroy the fruits of the ground, nor will your vine in the fields cast its grapes. All right. So he's basically saying, I will hold back on the locust thing. All right. Then verse 11, if they will do what is required, God will start the rain again. That's all that is. You've been robbing God of his worship. If you'll just do right, first of all, you've been robbing God of his worship. Secondly, you're cursed. You're already cursed, and you're cursed with a curse. I mean, locusts are coming. And then verse 11, if you'll just do what's right, this is what you have. So what does this mean for me? Because everything in the Bible does have something for me. Now, the law, we found out, if you watch the last video, I keep saying go to the last video, the one about under the law. One of the things we explore is Galatians chapter 3, and an understanding that Paul gets helped him to understand about the law. The law can teach us things. So what does this mean for me? Now, you have to understand, and this is good Bible study, we're in the application part. How do I apply Malachi? What is it really telling me? Well, first of all, I need to understand what it's saying to the Israelites, because it cannot mean today what it's never meant. So what did it mean for them? For the Jewish nation, it meant get back to tithing. That's what that particular section of Malachi is about. You're robbing God, and there are consequences for stealing his worship, plain and simple. That's how they would have understood it, and that's what they would have applied, how they would have applied it. Worship was a compensated program. Okay, so if anyone had any question as to, well, wait a minute, I don't understand, God. Well, what are we not doing? I'm trying to worship you from my heart. Well, under the law, it was a compensated program. Okay, God set it up so that the Levites could 24 hours a day bring him the worship he needed, requiring the obedience of the Jews who were given the option of being blessed or cursed. You read that in Deuteronomy. I set before you this day a blessing and a curse. The blessing comes first. And so he was basically here. They would have understood God blessed us first, and all he wanted us to do is take what he blessed us with, because he blessed us with enough to do the whole tithing thing, and to get back to that so that his worship gets back together. All right. They lost that blessing through their disobedience. So they would have understood that, why things weren't going very well. All right. For me, as an individual, the principle is still the same. God blesses first and gives us the stewardship responsibility. It's still the same. So what I mean by still the same is God blesses first. People will tell you that you give in order to get. They will say you will get blessed if you give. Wrong. That is backwards. Very backwards. You are blessed to give. You're blessed to give. All right. You're blessed to give. Giving is still a part of worship. I mean, it is. But worship is something that you do now under grace freely. God doesn't have a system set up that forces you to do it. You're under grace, it's freely done. So tithing is not binding on us, but we can learn from it. And before I'm going to give you a slide from the last one, just explaining to you tithing under the law does teach us something about giving. But let me just say this, because someone is sitting there and they're probably saying, okay, hold on. You say God blesses me first, but I don't have a job, or something is going on. I don't have anything. I'm really, hey, watch this next thing, because in this next thing, I'm going to show you something. Didn't I tell you that God blessed the Israelites first? He said, I put before you a blessing and a curse, that you're going to have enough to eat well and be satisfied, and you're going to have enough to do the tithing. Okay, so this was from the last video, and these were my conclusions, but you need to pay close attention because this will help you to understand how to apply Malachi. The law teaches us, not binds us. So Malachi can teach us something. It doesn't bind us to tithing. We can't impose tithing based on the law. We got that. We can learn from tithing in the law. Now, here's what we learned. Giving should be used for, and there were three buckets. There were three different tithes. The first one, compensation for those who lead worship. We see that with the Levites. The Levitical tribe received something from all three tithes. All right, one of them was directly for them. So for us today, then in our giving, we're investing in those who lead us in worship, whether that is the teachers, the pastor, or whatever the case may be. Whoever needs to be compensated can be compensated. That even the church secretary who keeps all the records and does all those things and helps, whatever the case may be, if they are helping to lead worship, they can be compensated. They don't have to be compensated. The church that I pastor is strictly voluntary. Everyone holds a position is voluntary, including me. It's voluntary. None of us are compensated for what we do. All right. But that is what your giving is for. It's and in that compensation may be, the cost of materials, the cost of buildings, whatever the case may be. All right. All of those costs that allow you to come together and worship. Okay. Secondly, there's congregational celebrations. That was tithe number 2. It was a celebratory tithe, and it was a way of understanding and celebrating the fact that you put God first. And so what they would do is that they would take another tenth and they would actually use that to basically have a party. That's what it was. So that what we understand is our giving today, we shouldn't forget that. We should celebrate God in the fact that he does bless us first. He says, I want you to share in that. We're going to get together. So again, the church where I am pastor, one of the things we do is we have celebrations throughout the year. In fact, I would say we have celebrations weekly. Every Wednesday night before Bible study, we have a meal together, and no one is ever asked to give. It's a celebration. It's based on what is given. So if people are giving, you should be able to celebrate. If you can't celebrate, then you have to go back and relook at how you are allocating what you're receiving and what you're doing from that perspective. So there should be the celebration. I will tell you, I will say, if a church is saying we're going to have a picnic, but everybody got to pay, no, not right. It just didn't right. We're going to do this, but everyone is assessed. We got an annual day, but you're all assessed a certain amount of, nope, wrong. No, not supposed to do that. Not supposed to do that. And I can show you that. All right. Earmarked portion for those in need. So this goes back to that individual that may say, well, I don't have anything. I don't understand. Well, they had a welfare part of that. So if God was blessing Israel and blessing individuals with enough that they could tithe, the third tithe, every third year, what they did have to do was set aside for the widow, the orphan, all right, and the stranger. These three would not have had any way to obtain any food to eat because of the position that they were in. So I would say the principle there is, if someone is in a position where they can't eat, they really need help, the church can do that. But I also say, if you look at the New Testament, Paul says that you're not to be dependent upon the church for charity, that what should happen is the family should help their own family members. That should happen first. So as an individual, what I should be able to do is try to help out my own family member before they go to the church. The church should be the last stop. And even then, when someone comes to the church should use, in my estimation, being a good steward, every avenue that is out there in order to help someone. You don't just start running off giving people money when maybe there's an organization out there that has set up funds that would help them. You use what God has provided. I think God provides all of that. So that's how that helps. So my conclusions for this video. If you've watched this far, and hopefully it's been interesting, here's my conclusions for this video. There is no New Testament scripture that indicates the church is to tithe, not one. And by the way, there isn't one in the Old Testament either. Again, someone that wants to run back to Abram and try to tell you that we have to pattern ourselves after what he did, go watch my first video and that'll get blown right out of the water. Secondly, the early church under the apostles and their successors did not tithe. They didn't tithe. If they didn't, why do we have to now? Then church history, again, the Catholic Church had periods of tithing that were from corrupt motives. In the 4th and 6th century, they tied it to salvation. They said if you didn't tithe, you were going to hell. You know that is doctrinally way off and incorrect. Then the Church of England in the 10th century basically made it a civil thing. Everybody had to give to the church, whether you were going to hell or not, you were giving to the church. That was wrong as 2 left feet. All right. Protestants, the Protestant church had free will giving until the churches in America lost governmental support in the 1800s. And then in the 1800s, they came up with tithing as a way to finance the church, as opposed to continually their free will giving, because they had basically been too dependent upon the government and weren't being good stewards of what they were receiving. So lastly, Malachi. Malachi is the scheme. Malachi is the trick. Malachi is the way. Malachi, the whole what a man robbed God thing, that was written to the Jewish people under the old covenant and does not bind anyone now in the church age to tithing. It just doesn't. One of the things that you may not, and I don't know, preachers that in my estimation that push stuff like this, even really good Bible scholars that would never do this, but for some reason when it comes to tithing, one of the things they don't want to tell you is he was actually writing to the Israelites under the law, and the tithes, why it's plural, is because there was 3 of them, and then it was more, then there was required offerings, there was required all kinds of stuff, but they don't want to tell you that. So that's my conclusions for this video, and I hope that this has been interesting for you. And like I say, every time I go back and study it and I get a little deeper into it, I see the scheme, I see the scandal of it all. And I wonder, when is somebody really going to wake up and say, hey, let's actually do this right? But here's some encouraging news. There are churches out there that do it right. I'm not just talking about the one where I pastor. I mean, you got churches like John MacArthur's, and I know a lot of people don't like John, that's fine. But free will giving, you'd be surprised at how many out there are actually doing it, because they're actually looking in the Bible, they're actually studying the church history, they're actually looking at the context, and they understand what is actually being said, and they're not twisting things because the Bible is clear. Timothy's clear. The love of money, and remember that was written to pastors. That was written to pastors. That we're not to love money. If we love money, we find ourselves in a world of trouble. So share the video, give me your comments, tell me I'm off, tell me why I'm off. But before you do that, watch the first and second videos, because this one built upon those. And so the next time I'll come back and I'll talk about the prosperity gospel. Do that in one video. That is the cheap trick out there, and we'll do that. So again, check out my man T.L. Robinson for music, and then do me a favor, subscribe to what I got going on, and that's Brother Robinson. So have a good day. I appreciate you, or good night or good morning or whatever time it is when you watch this, but I appreciate you for watching.